Self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles, it's all the rage right now, and cars that can eventually drive themselves are nearly here. But that begs the question, what about the safety of you and me in a world where these vehicles need to protect passengers and pedestrians? Are we truly safe? How can we develop better systems to ensure safety between us and the car as we begin to see these vehicles on city streets? Imagine if we could design a user interface between cars and pedestrians so that both can communicate their intentions. My guest in this episode is Dave Day, and he's currently working on solving this problem. He's a UX researcher at the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. In our chat, we cover everything from his journey down this fascinating field to talking about developing the user experience and interface, as well as discussing the future of self-driving and what it means for humans and transport. I learn a lot speaking with him, and I hope you do too. And remember, if you like these episodes, don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, and comment. So with that, I hope you enjoy my chat with Dave Day. Hey Dave, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure.
First of all, thank you so much for basically coming on, and I really want to understand a little bit about what you're up to with regards to self-driving cars, all the work you're doing in autonomous vehicles, eHMIs, which is a very interesting topic that we should want to get into. But why don't you give a quick bio about yourself before we get started?
I have a background in computer science actually, and I studied like theoretical computer science, and then I went on the usual path to become a software engineer, and then well, long story short, I had a it was a personal experience that led me down the path of my interest towards automated driving and self-driving cars. So I was living in the U.S. I was living in Austin, Texas, back in 2012, I think it was, when I had a car crash. And yeah, so the ensuing investigation revealed that it was the result of the other driver looking at his GPS system and failing to observe a red light, and he had hit me, and the ensuing disaster. Although I was perfectly safe and everything, nothing happened to me physically. I was okay. It just like led me to this whole. Almost like not quite, but something like a post-traumatic stress disorder, where I was not able to drive for almost a year. Things like these, but it led me down this path of actually wondering uh, what happened there and how I could perhaps affect some change into that in the direction. And since it started from this whole perspective of human computer interaction, human machine interaction in the perspective of a car, I wanted to see if there was something. I had a computer science background, and I thought, okay, there is some sort of an element there. Maybe there's something I can do, and that took me in the direction of the human factors of also automobiles in general, even factors of driving. And then now the whole domain is now moving towards automated driving, self-driving cars, and that's how I ended up here. So I back then when the crash happened, I was a software engineer working in Austin, and then I decided that in order to be able to effectively contribute and really see where this is going, I needed to really take a deep dive. So I decided to get back into academia, and so I just came to the Netherlands to pursue a PhD in this topic. And I have recently finished my PhD, and I'm continuing my research as a postdoc here. And yeah, that's the short history of how I ended up where I am.
Did you, with that experience, I'm sure it definitely left an imprint on you mentally. And, it's not every day where people are affected by these events and they decide to do something about it, right? And I felt like you were motivated to really do something proactive about helping not yourself, but potentially other people as well, right? And I was wondering, like, with the studies that you did in the Netherlands, because you've been there for several years now. I know that obviously self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles are very big here in the US as well. Was there any availability of that type of study that you wanted to pursue in the US, or was it only available in the Netherlands or in Europe, especially?
Well, that's a good question. My decision to come to the Netherlands was not particularly because I couldn't have done done a similar kind of research in the US, but rather because I wanted to uh, have a quick turnaround of this realignment of career goals. So at that point, uh, having already been a software engineer, having already worked in industry for a while, I didn't want to quote unquote become a student for a very long time again. So I wondered what was the quickest way where I can just have a quick wet my feet and get back into industry again. And at that point, PhD was not in my radar yet. I thought I wanted to do a quick kind of a program, which I had found out in the Netherlands. They have something called a PDN, a professional doctorate in engineering, which is a 2 year program and not one of the usual 5 year programs or 4 or 5 year programs as a PhD. So I thought, okay, yeah, I will be able to do that and get back to the industry, and that's why I went to the came to the Netherlands. And then, well, destiny has other plans. So while I finished my PDN, realized that I wanted to this PhD position opened up, and I this was exactly in the area that I was already kind of doing in my PDN, and then I decided it made most sense to continue because I was really invested in the research, and it allowed me to take a deeper dive than I ever could have.
Yeah, no, that's really amazing, and I'm glad to hear that everything worked out when you went there. And definitely, I know that Europe has a strong, interest in autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars. And I don't know what the differences are between where they are and where the US is now. But do you want to just shed some light on, I know in the US, at least here in the Bay Area in California, there's a lot of regulations, and I think there's a lot of now interest in having these vehicles out in the roads doing testing, and a lot of the approvals have come from the Californian government, right? But what's the perception over there in Europe? What are the regulations like about and allowing these sort of vehicles on the road?
Well, it is similar here in Europe compared to the US, also in California or Pennsylvania or even Arizona, I think, where there are some really heavy regulations in place where automated cars, are not allowed without at least a safety driver behind the wheel. But then that's also why we have several facilities for closed track testing, and this is also this has been one of the sticking points in our research as well, because of course we want to test our technology and all the things all the potential interactions that we want to test in as realistic situations as possible. But then safety comes first, and we before we want to take that into real life, we want to make sure that it is kind of fail safe enough to get to that point, and because of regulations, we often cannot quite have automated cars flying on the road, which is also why we take we resort to other methods of why how can we have an illusion of automated car without actually using automated cars. And this is also something that perhaps you yeah, it became a big point of news in 2017 and 2018 as well. Ford and Virginia Tech, they were doing some experiments where they had a van with a person sitting inside a seat suit in the driver's seat. So it looked like there was nobody in the car, but there was actually somebody driving. It was a faking an automated car. So we also have yeah, conducted similar experiments and uh, tested interactions with automated cars, which are not actually automated cars, and it somehow sells the illusion.
Right, right. And I get the feeling that, you know, there's such a huge disparity between what people think self driving cars are and
Yeah.
what they are now.
Hmm.
There's such a mountain to climb when it comes to progress. And I think we've made a lot of good progress. I think companies like Google, with Waymo and Uber and Apple and all those big companies are trying to at least incentivize the industry with their research and obviously including Tesla with their autonomy and all that stuff. But I want to understand a little bit about, and this is obviously for the readers, the listeners too, because we all understand that yes, self-driving cars is it's happening and it's in progress,
Hmm.
but we just don't necessarily understand how difficult it is, right? So
Hmm.
what are the major challenges, especially when it comes to your research, that self-driving cars and sort of autonomous vehicles are facing right now, and how do we overcome those challenges?
That's a very good question, Barry. I think quite apart from the technological challenges like sensing and vision and navigation and maps and all that, when I am particularly looking at the human side of the equation, how we as either passengers or drivers or even as pedestrians and cyclists and or other road users interact with cars or self-driving cars in particular, the question becomes how do we know what the car is doing? Because normally we would want to look inside, like in our daily life when we are a pedestrian. Let's stick to that example. If we are trying to cross the road, the most obvious thing to do without even thinking about it, we try to look inside the car, perhaps to see what the driver is doing, whether he or she is aware of their situation, of their surroundings. And given that that is not going to be the case for automated cars, either there might be nobody inside, or maybe there is somebody inside doing something else, sleeping, taking a call, whatever it may be. So, as a pedestrian, I can no longer look inside to the human occupant to determine the intention of the car. So then the question becomes how do I know what the car is doing? Whether it's aware of what's going on around it, whether it's gonna abide by the traffic law, whether it is going to yield to me, whether it's gonna be safe for me. All these kinds of questions. The critical question is, am I safe around it? Um, and then most of the research around it revolves around finding different ways to have the self-driving car communicate to its environment. A very The question at its root is whether this communication is even necessary, because we sometimes think that perhaps we make too much of a big deal of a very natural and neutral situation. Maybe we really don't need this explicit communication all the time. And that's also sometimes we have found that most normal situations we don't really explicitly seek confirmation from drivers. We are very good as humans as to just simply look at kinematical cues and dynamics, the movement-based dynamics of the car, and simply understand, oh, the car is slowing down. And if that seems to be in alignment with our expectations, most of the times we don't need to look inside or get additional confirmation. But if there is this conflict or contradiction, then there definitely comes this need for further confirmation. And then comes this need for communication, which is what most of my research has been on. And now, coming back to your question on what is the industry struggling with, or what is this research community most struggling with at this point, is how number one, how to achieve this communication so that it's intuitive, it's not overwhelming, it doesn't take a steep learning curve, it doesn't create a whole new language that we like if there are all kinds of cars flashing and making sounds around us, then it's going to be chaos in an already chaotic and noisy environment. So the biggest part of the research community is still trying. We are still trying to figure out what's the best way to achieve this goal. And then the follow-up challenge is how to standardize this, because it's not just one. So it's all different kinds of research communities, both in academia and industry, are doing this research in parallel. And while we are collaborating, we are at different phases and we are exploring different sides of the same coin all at the same time. it's really critical to kind of all come everybody coming to the same page and making sure that okay, we do make sure that um, Ford doesn't start communicating in one way while BMW is doing something else. And just examples, of course, but yeah. So this standardization is a very big issue that we members of my lab, my supervisor, my boss as well. She is a part of the International Standards Organization, the ISO steering committee. That's a part of like making these kind of standardization decisions, and there are lots of other parties involved. And so these yeah, this is, in my opinion, this is one of the biggest challenge right now. And I think
Yeah.
maybe if I can even add to that, sorry, you were going to say
No,
something.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think thinking about it, what another big challenge is educating educating the public, educating everyone, like what the car is capable of, because oftentimes we tend to get into situations such as over trust or under trust. We see those situations with Tesla all the time where people, but well, there's this novelty factor, of course, that people are really curious and fascinated by this car, which is able to quote unquote drive itself for some stretches while it is not fully automated. But then we get into those situations where people just simply, like we have YouTube videos of people sleeping behind Tesla wheels, and we have several incidents of people like crashes that happen because of negligence. So that's a classic example of people overestimating what the system is capable of. But the other side of the coin is also equally um, critical and maybe even a bit frustrating, because like maybe there are situations where the system is perfectly capable of handling everything, but since not everybody might be able to know the edge cases or the boundaries of the system or what it's capable of, they don't trust it and they're constantly on the edge, and that kind of takes away the point of automation anyway. So striking this balance, what we call trust calibration, is really challenging, and this is an open question, and we are still trying to figure out. So how do we know how do we know what the current level of trust is with a person, and how do we make sure that we communicate at any given point what the car is capable of, and um, whether they need to do anything. So this is the limit of what you can expect from the car, and that's where you need to step in. And this will become more and more. This is particularly critical now, where we don't have full automation, where we have automation in only stretches, like we see on the Tesla cars, um, uh, only in stretches of highways, and you have to still take care of the environment. And if anything happens, you are still responsible. So, in those situations, knowing what the car is capable of and what I am responsible for as the driver is really critical.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and for me, that's I didn't know that. For me to really, as you frame it in that way, necessarily it doesn't make sense, because there are so many aspects to self-driving that people don't know about, and people are not, people who are buying these vehicles are not, they might be tech people, they might be tech heads, it might not be, but you can't assume that. And you need to make the assumption that people are going to use these vehicles to obviously take them from point A to point B.
Yeah,
However, you cannot underestimate what they're trying to do with these vehicles. They could obviously, as you said, you see these YouTube videos of people showing off and all of these things. And for me, it sounds like there needs to be more education about
absolutely.
the power and the capability of self-driving cars. And you also mentioned about the fact that right now, especially with Tesla, there are definitely constraints about where you can take the vehicle in a very autonomous mode. For example, highways, right, where it sort of is trained for those environments. However, when it comes to city streets or it comes to narrow lanes, that's where the real challenges are, because there you're not just faced with the urban environment, but you're faced with people, and you're faced with a lot of variables that can change at any given time. And this sort of brings me into the sort of the talking point about eHMIs, right? And the stuff
Yeah.
that you're working with. Do you want to just provide a quick overview of, number one, what is an eHMI, and what are examples of how what an eHMI can do for, to sort of help the self-driving community?
Absolutely. So eHMI, the word stands for External Human Machine Interfaces, eHMI, and this is a sort of a communication device, for the lack of a better term, which we have placed on the outside of a car, of a self-driving car that we use to facilitate the car to communicate with its environment. So to other road users, essentially. So you and me as pedestrians, cyclists, other drivers, the kind of people that we already kind of talked about a moment ago. How do we know what the car is up to? How do we know whether it is safe for me? All these kinds of questions. eHMI is a way for the car to provide this kind of information and communicate with the external world. And to answer your question of how eHMIs can facilitate this, or what are different ways the eHMI can be effective. So, yeah, this is very much an open question. We don't have the golden egg yet, and this is also why this has been a part of my research for the last 4 years, and this is still very much, we are not close to one answer. But the thing is that there are different kinds of ways that a car can try to communicate, and there are several concepts or visions out there, and different car companies, including Daimler or Mercedes-Benz, and Nissan, Volvo, all of them have come up with different ways in which this perhaps could be accomplished. Even Google and Toyota, they have patents regarding this. And we are looking at it from a more academic perspective, because most of the times we see visions of what this interface could look like. They look very appealing on paper. So I maybe you might be aware of the Daimler F015 concept. If you, I'll just quickly explain it anyway. So it's a back in 2015, Daimler came up with this like fantastic, futuristic, fascinating concept of a self-driving car, and one aspect of it was this eHMI as well, with which it was would communicate with other road users. And what it did was it projected kind of a zebra crossing in front of on the road surface in front of the car, and it could, when it knew that it was approaching a person standing on the side of the road, and it wanted to let them know that it was safe for them to pass, the car would slow down, but not only slow down, but also project this image of a zebra crossing in front of the pedestrian and animate it in green, all kinds of visual cues to kind of show that, okay, I am yielding to you, it is safe for you to cross. Nissan, I think, Nissan had this, this other concept called the IDS concept, in which they had sort of a thin light band all around the body of the car. So it was a light strip essentially, which kind of showed with a little bit of a tiny sliver of light by following any road user. So if you were a cyclist or a pedestrian, let's say you're walking next to the car, it showed with a little tiny sliver of light by following you that, oh, I recognize you, I see you are there. So there is this kind of a situational awareness of the car. And there were other forms of it. We also see things like a display, like, okay, please cross, or after you, or things like messages that clearly say that the car is yielding to somebody. There was another quite interesting concept that came out back in 2016, I think. It was by a Swedish company called Semcon, and they had something called a smiling car, in which they had the grill, the air intake, the grill of the front grill of the car. It had a display in it where, when the car was just cruising or driving it by itself, it just had a neutral kind of a light bar. But when the car was trying to yield to someone, the light bar would morph into kind of a smile as a friendly gesture that the car is yielding to the pedestrian. So these are the different kinds of visions of some examples of eHMI. And I just gave you 4 examples, but there are plenty out there. So recently we wrote a paper where we identified, I think, about 70 or such eHMI concepts, academic and industry or patent roundabout. But yeah, again, this came to this brought us to the challenge that there are so many ideas out there, and we really we are not really closer to finding out which one holds merit. So that's also why there is a need for systematic testing, and that's also what a big part of my research is about.
So with the research that you are doing, and you mentioned, a whole bunch of examples from all of these companies, right? And it definitely makes sense because you're trying to these vehicles are designed to communicate a message to the user or a pedestrian or whatever. But at the same time, I find that it's great to have all of these signals and all of these sensors in place, but how feasible do you think that really is based on your research so far? Because have you done experiments where there are pedestrians, or you have subjects who are sort of in the middle crossing the road, the car detects you there and then stops, but then there's a decision that needs to be made. Does the car stop and do something about it, or should the pedestrian, give way to the car? So it's sort of those that language and that communication that is really vital in these sort of situations. What has your research shown in terms of that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think one of the biggest worries in this field has always been that when people understand that automated cars, they have sensors, the sensors don't quit. If the automated car is able to see me, they will act defensively. So there was this worry that if people understand this strategy or this kind of algorithm of the defensive behavior of automated cars, then pedestrians will behave with some sort of impunity. They will just be kings of the road. Okay, even if it's not my right of way, I'm just going to step in because it's an automated car. It's going to stop for me. But those were in the beginning. We struggled a lot with these questions because we wondered whether this argument was one of the foundation of even the question of whether we should even show that a car is automated in the first place. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe in order to avoid an automated car from being bullied by pedestrians, we just make it look as similar to, as obscure, as normal as possible, if you will. But then as we ran several studies, and it's not just studies from our lab, it's several surveys all over the world, it has usually shown that people are generally a bit hesitant and a bit lacking in trust towards new automation technology. So if the car is automated, the gut reaction is not, oh, I'm gonna bully it or I'm gonna step in front of it, but rather I'm gonna stand back and see what it's gonna do. I don't trust it yet. So this is almost the other side of the coin. This is almost this is even more frustrating because then if there is so I wouldn't say more frustrating. That's a but this is equally frustrating because that takes away from the efficacy or from the usefulness of deploying automation in the first place. So one of the biggest reason why we want automation is effective or increasing the throughput of traffic or making traffic stops more efficient. So one of the things was that with vehicle-to-vehicle communication, most of the times when a traffic light goes from red to green, it takes us a few seconds to be aware of that and get going. So by the time the 5 cars have gone, the right light's gone red again. And with automated cars, this can very well be avoided because with the system, with the vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure communication, everyone knows what each car knows when the light is going to turn, and they can, just like a train, kind of go all in once, and it increases the throughput. But there are such kinds of benefits of automation, but if it will be such a pity if hesitation and mistrust holds back adoption of this technology. So when it comes to how people interact with automated cars, the question that you asked, one of the things that we really try to observe what people do with current cars. We wanted to see with manually driven cars right now, what are people doing? How are they? What are they looking at? What kind of information do they seek in order to cross a road when there's an approaching car? And we, for instance, ran an eye tracking study. So we basically put a mobile eye tracker on a pedestrian, and we asked them to cross a road in the presence of an approaching car. And we found that there is no one definitive answer to where people look at when crossing a road. And there seems to be a decisive pattern where people look. It's not just one element, but when the car is, for instance, very far away, it's not a threat. People can simply cross. So people tend to look everywhere: a road, environment, sky, trees. But as the car gets closer and starts becoming a little bit of a threat, then there is a uh, very recurrent pattern that exists where the gaze pattern, the sight, the fixations move from the road surface right in front of the car to the bumper, to the grill and headlights, to the hood, and then it kind of goes up. It's this scanning motion. It goes up and then rests on the windshield where people expect to see the driver. So we speculate from that this is most likely because this is the part of the car that will hit or that will be the closest to the pedestrian that would cause an impact if there was to be an impact. So that's danger zone. So people really are drawn to that. And then as the car comes closer or it slows down and there is some sort of an ambiguity regarding whether or not the car is really stopping and there is a need to get that confirmation, that's when people start looking at the driver inside. To really, not necessarily to get eye contact, as a lot of people, we have a tendency to really think that, oh, we look inside the car to get eye contact. But that's not really the case. We also found that it's not necessarily eye contact as in the sense of I look at the driver and the driver looks at me, but rather more I want to get a sense of what the driver is up to, whether he or she is aware of the environment, whether if he or she is looking around, if he or she looks alert. Those are already indicators of what we can expect from a car. And most of the times it's very hard to see inside the car anyway because of the reflections from the windshield or the darkness of the interior. So, but despite all of that, we saw that there was this very strong tendency to look at the driver. So then we repeated the experiment with an automated car, or like a fake automated car, which appeared to be automated. There was nobody inside, so the driver was hidden. And there we saw that once people realized that the car is automated, then the tendency to look inside the car was already kind of gone. So it wasn't a habit formation because we expected that we are so intrinsically drawn to this behavior of like looking for the driver that even with an automated car, we expected pedestrians might do that, but we saw that they didn't. So when we had just an automated car with no communication at all, for instance, people were simply looking at the motion patterns, the kinematics of the car, and they were very, they already were able to gauge the intention of the car simply from that. When we augmented that automated car with an eHMI, the external human-machine interface, we saw a really marked improvement in the performance, or like we found that pedestrians really were able to make decisions about the intention of the car or about their safety or whether they wanted to cross the road a lot quicker. So we do have some evidence that these kinds of eHMIs, these kind of communication devices do work in alleviating some of this confusion and ambiguity. But then again, we also found that this is not universal. This is not absolute. So there has to be sort of a concurrence between what the car says it will do and what the car actually does. So we also did some kind of like what we call breaching studies, in which we pit different behaviors against each other. So we had something like the eHMI is telling that the car will be yielding, but the car seems to be coming at a pretty high speed. It doesn't seem to be yielding, even though it says it is. So we wondered, what will people do then? Do they simply trust the eHMI, or what takes over? And yes, as expected, the behavior of the car, the speed of the car, it's the telltale sign. Like if the no matter what the car says it will do, if it doesn't look like it's stopping, people don't simply take the word of the eHMI for granted and step in the road. And that was more of a comforting finding, so to say. Like we even if there is a malfunction, let's say, like there was some sensor problems where the eHMI announced that the car would stop. but it actually didn't. They're like people simply, it's obviously unideal. This should never happen, but if it does, in the worst case scenario, like we have some faith that okay, it's the behavior of the car that still is what people look at. And yeah, I mean, this is very interesting, and it goes on. Okay, I can talk for hours about this, but maybe I should stop and let you ask questions.
No, I think that was a great explanation on what eHMIs are, because definitely I can see that that will definitely help the interaction
Yeah.
between the autonomous vehicle, sort of this inanimate object, and the human, right? But
Mhm.
at the same time, as you just sort of describe that situation, it really strikes me that there's a lot of trust in there as well, because you are expecting the vehicle to follow its rules. There's a algorithm that it needs to prescribe to, and that algorithm cannot break, because if it announces something to the external world, like you and myself, that hey, I'm going to stop or give you way, then I as a human need to trust what you're telling me. I need to put my trust in a machine that has been designed by a company or by engineers that believe that what they're programming into this car is correct, right? But at the same time, I would hope that, and I really, really hope that people have common sense to at least evaluate the situation and understand that if the car does not behave as intended to, even though I'm seeing this conflicting message,
Yeah.
then I need to do something about it at that same time. And it's really that sort of give and take, and that sort of trust mechanism between man and machine. So with that, I feel like that's one particular challenge that you're faced with. But at the same time, I can definitely understand that if there is a somewhat universal language
Mhm.
about how these machines can communicate, and there's this sort of standardization, as you mentioned before, with the standards body, then I believe there could be some sort of path forward to making sure that self-driving cars are not just efficient, but they're also safe as well. So, with that, has there been any interest in the studies that you've conducted with your peers by larger manufacturers like Ford? Have they shown any interest in what you guys have done to really get that feedback from you guys and maybe start to prototype, start to implement some of those features in their next iteration of self-driving vehicles?
Yeah, indeed. So there, we work very closely with industry partners as well. However, most of the times, like sometimes we do our research with a more theoretical question in mind, and sometimes with a more implementation focus. And right now, we are when it comes to eHMIs, the focus has been this research is so much in its nascent stages that we are not quite there, ready for implementation yet. So indeed, we have done studies with several industry partners, and there are, as I also mentioned, that my supervisor, she's herself involved in the standardization body, the ISO, and there is this constant dissemination of academic information to the industry partners in those kinds of meetings as well. So one good example would be when we in the early days when we started talking about how to facilitate communication at a very basic level. eHMIs need to convey whether a pedestrian should walk or not walk. And then one of the obvious solutions was, why not just have a traffic light on the car? Why not have the red or green or yellow, those kind of like variations or adaptations of those very well understood symbols on the car. And we actually ran studies like that. For instance, when we one of the biggest questions was what happens when we all understand what green or red means on a traffic pole, because it's stationary. The traffic pole doesn't move. So if it says red, it's meant for me. But what does red mean when it's on a car? Does red mean the car is stopping, or is it asking me to stop? So when it's behind the car, for instance, in the brake lights, it goes red. It's asking me to stop. But what happens if it's in front of the car? So if I see an approaching automated car and it shows me a message, and the eHMI shows a message which is a red light. We wondered this, and we ran this study with hundreds of people. And while most of the times we do tend to have this association of the ego self, like it's egocentric interpretation of message. So we see a red light, we think it's meant for me, as in the car is telling me not to cross. We see a green light, the car is telling me to cross. While this is the majority perception, we did find a significant minority, but still a significant amount of people who simply say green means the car is going, so I shouldn't go, and the red means that the car is stopping, so I should go. So this can cause a really big and fatal misunderstanding. So we also found that this is not going to be red and green. The common arguments of using traffic light colors on the car is not a good idea. So that's also why the industry as a whole, is moving towards using more neutral colors for this kind of communication. And the color that is becoming the color of choice is more like a cyan or a turquoise or a bluish green kind of a color. And there are several other reasons why many other colors might not be used. So several standardization bodies like SAE or UNESE, they all already mandate several colors that cannot be used. For instance, orange and amber colored lights are used in construction vehicles. Blue lights are used in emergency vehicles. All of these, there are several other colors which we cannot use. So then it was a matter of finding not only a color that was unused, that was sort of neutral, that could be attributed to a new communication language, if you will, but also serves the purpose of this kind of communication. And that's where we kind of ended up with Cyan. And then this was like this insight was kind of found by several research groups. We in our research group we did a similar study, but then it was corroborated by other groups as well, and then it got kind of disseminated to the industry, and that's what all the new patents and the new trends are going in the direction. So all the new eHMIs that, for instance, Mercedes Daimler is testing on their cars are all in that color. Another example is, for instance, the use of symbols. So a very natural question is, why don't we use commonly understood symbols like a walking pedestrian or like the hand sign? We understand that as a stop, or the walking pedestrian as we see that on traffic lights as well. Like they are comparatively more unambiguous compared to just traffic lights. Why can't we use them on the car? But then comes the question of liability. So if the car says somebody else or pedestrians or other road users what to do, if the car's message is an instruction, then it's also assumed that the car should be able to take liability of what happens as a result of that instruction. So if a pedestrian starts walking because the car told him or her to, and then there was somebody else who didn't see the person and came from behind and hit them. So who is culpable at that point? So all these kinds of ethics and liability and legal issues get intertwined quite quickly once we start going in that direction. And so most of the times the community has started to prescribe that a car should never tell other people what to do. It can say what it is going to do. I intend to stop. I intend to slow down. The pedestrian can do what they want with that information, but it should never issue an advice or an instruction. And since symbols like walking pedestrian or that hand sign, they are instructional, they do carry an advisory message. That's why they are not good candidates for use there. And
Got it.
yeah,
Yeah, I know you mentioned the traffic light symbol as well, and I can imagine people will get confused,
yeah,
especially when they're behind the wheel, on Monday to Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday they're the pedestrian, and they're getting mixed signals from the car, and it's like, hang on a second, they have to do a small computation in their head to figure out what should I be doing, and I think you mentioned that there's a lot of ambiguity there
yeah.
and try to sort of distinguish between the colors and trying to figure out a new color to really showcase what the intentions of the car is planning to do. But you also mentioned about that really, and it's an important note to make about that the car will not tell the pedestrian what to do. And that's a very it's an ethical point as well, because when you start to think about no one behind the wheel, and you start to think about who is at fault, and then all of these legal ramifications,
Mhm.
has that sort of space of ethics really come into play in your sort of your research, or do you think you treat that as a separate field?
Yeah, another very good question. We consider this very important for our research, but we don't let it affect our studies for the short term, because we still want to investigate the theory behind human behavior. So we want to see what are the effects of, let's say, an instructional message. And we will, for the sake of understanding interactions and behavior, we will use instructional message and pit them against advisory or intentional messages and see how they perform. And so uh, indeed, some of the ethical implications can be derived from the insights of our studies, and that's also why that's always overarching. It's always looming in our thought process, but it's not necessarily inhibiting the experiments we do ourselves to get there anyway.
Got it.
Yeah,
Got it. That makes sense.
yeah.
I wanted to talk about the interactions, and sort of this is just sort of going forward with the conversation about eHMIs, but
Mhm.
really about congestion, because there have been reports about people mentioning that with self-driving cars, congestion can actually get worse. And traffic would be even 10 times as worse as it is today. So, what are your thoughts about that? Because I can imagine if you're on an intersection, or if you are in a very dense urban environment, you need to make sure that in order to promote efficiency, you need to make sure people follow the rules. You need to make sure that these cars follow the rules as well.
Yeah.
And so, what are your thoughts about congestion in general? Do you think that if hypothetically there was a city that was completely autonomous, what are your expectations about the way that congestion is going to be relieved or created from that environment?
Uh, this is a multifaceted question, Barry, and I like this question very much because a lot rests on it. I think the key word here is the city is completely autonomous. So I I am of the opinion that if we are able to handle the infrastructure in a way that every single element or entity of the traffic is automated, it can communicate with each other as well as the infrastructure, we can alleviate congestion. However, the problem is in the early phases of when we have to share road space with partly automated and partly non-automated traffic. And as hard as it is a pill to swallow, we humans are the biggest bottlenecks. So we can be unpredictable, we can be chaotic, we can be a bit slow to understand dynamics, rapidly changing situations, and of course, we are very good at adapting. Once we know what it is, we can incorporate that in our daily language. But in the beginning, of course, when we are talking about mixed traffic, we are the biggest disruptors of efficiency in that case. So as long as we go through that flux of the change between and acceptance of more and more autonomous vehicles in our non-automated counterparts and driving entities, we will probably see congestion arising from elements such as this mistrust, this hesitation. There will be a little bit of a delay in processing information. Like, okay, I see, as a driver, I see there is this automated car going. Uh, I might want to be a little bit more careful. I might want to keep a little bit more of a distance just to be on the safe side.
Mm,
These will
mm,
all be contributing factors. But as we get more and more used to understanding automated cars, I believe that these things will start to change as well. And that's why we are deeply in need for longitudinal studies to see how the behavior evolves over time. But yeah, but at this point, one can only speculate. And I think in the long term, if it's an all automated environment, I think congestion is one of the things that will be most helped by automation.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. And as you mentioned, there's going to be a transitory period
Yeah.
where there'll be a shift, and it won't be an easy shift. I think the people will have to come to grips with the idea of self-driving, and they will have to sort of reprogram their brain to really not. And this comes back to your anecdote about people looking at the grill and sort of watching their eye sort of move up the bonnet and then to the driver. So I feel like there's a lot of reprogramming involved on the human psyche
Mhm.
where when it comes to this evolution of self-driving. When you conduct your studies, how do you actually proceed, and how do you, from a logistics standpoint, do you just bring in samples and people who are interested in participating? How do you procure your so-called sort of like your self-driving cars, semi self-driving cars with people in them? Is this something that you're doing on a daily basis? And what is the sample size that you're targeting right now?
Yeah, so most of the times we do the experiments in our university campus. So oftentimes we end up using the university participant database as our participant as our uh, target demographic. So it comprises of university students and staff essentially. So we do tend to get all kinds of different ages from 19 years old, well, until about 60 years old. And most of the times we tend to run studies that when we are particularly dealing with physical experiments with participants, we deal with anywhere between 30 to 60 participants. But this is also a really um, a challenge, because most of the times when uh, like the university demographic, no matter how diverse we want it to be, or even we manage to get the diverse set of participants, it will never be representative of the public in general. And we oftentimes we also don't get to test with edge cases of the demographic, like let's say children or the elderly or people with accessibility needs, and all these kinds of special cases need special attention, which we don't quite handle on a regular basis, but we also recognize the need for it very much. And there are several of my colleagues who are focusing on those kinds of areas of research. But then again, when we do studies which are not with physical participants, for instance, things that can be done remotely or over surveys, then it's easier to deal with a higher number of participants, and then we deal with in the order of 200, 500, or even 1,000 participants. Uh, yeah, yeah, that's about, yeah, it kind of depends on what kind of study we run. And then, yeah, we divide the load accordingly.
Are you doing any cross collaboration with other academic institutions around the
Absolutely,
world?
yes. Yeah, we have collaborations with several universities in Germany, in Sweden, and the UK. And I am also in touch with several colleagues from the US as well. So uh, Stanford University is doing some really cool work in this area. So is Cornell. So even though we always make sure to be on the same page, and also kind of, not only is it important to not um, so it's kind of wasteful. It's a waste of resources if we just do the same experiment over and over again. So we really, it's important that we kind of be on the same page with each other, and so we can support and corroborate each other instead of doing replication of the same studies. But also, it's kind of, we also realized that it was important to maybe do the same studies in different geographical locations to account for the cultural and the psychological differences in how people interact with traffic in these different geographical areas. So no matter how similar traffic in Western Europe and North America are, there are still minor differences. And for instance, in the Netherlands, jaywalking is not disallowed. In the US and UK, it is. In Canada too, I believe. But here in the Netherlands, we are not allowed to walk across the road with 10 meters from a zebra crossing. But we are allowed to exercise our judgment and make sure that it's safe and it will not cause an unsafe situation, and we can cross the road in the middle of the road. But these are the small things that can change imperceptibly even the way people interact in traffic, and it's important to account for these minor differences to see if they can actually have some major impact down the line.
What's what is your intention for the research that you're doing right now? I mean, what are you hoping to accomplish, achieve in the next 2 to 3 years with the stuff that you're working on right now?
Good question. This topic has so many unanswered questions that I don't think that we will be arriving at a solution anytime soon. But at the same time, I think my hope is to continue to like poke at these frayed edges and see where we can get with that. So we are also trying to explore various ways of perhaps seeing hacking this communication that we talked about. Like so far, we have talked about eHMI communicating through lights or through sound. But one thing that we are exploring right now is how perhaps can we use biomimicry to communicate.
And what is that?
Biomimicry, by biomimicry, I mean uh, somehow incorporating inspiration from the animal world around us to see how animals or plants or insects or birds will communicate, and see if we can somehow mm, infuse some of those elements in our car in some kind of a
Mm,
sentient being. So one of the things we were trying to see, for instance, was that when a cat gets angry or when a hedgehog tries to ward off a predator, it makes itself bigger, it just balloons up. Puffer fish, for instance. So it shows signs of aggression. Or when a bird comes into land, it deploys its feathers. And with all these kinds of different movements, we already see um, the intention behind a certain gesture. And we are trying to explore here whether such kind of movement based or kinematic based gestures can somehow be extended to car communication. So if we, maybe this is a ridiculous idea, we will find out. But we are still exploring the idea of treating the car as maybe a sentient being, because we already know several people have treat the car as a being, as a pet, or as an extension of their personality. They ascribe personality to their car, so it's not a far cry to like, yeah, well, of course some people do simply treat cars as an appliance, but for many, like, the car is an extension, and for it won't be such a leap to consider the car as a sentient being which is capable of some kind of a communication. And there have been plenty of studies done as well, not in form of outside communication, but by ascribing some kind of a voice personality to the car. Something like Knight Rider, for instance. Like the car could talk and it had a personality. And there were several experiments which showed what kind of a personality had most effect on compliance in passengers. So it does show that some kind of ascribing sentience to a vehicle is not a new thing. It can work. It can actually have a surprisingly strong effect, and we are trying to use those kind of peripheral insights with this new topic of biomimicry-based communication to see if it has any promise, for instance. So yeah, check back in a year.
Well, I think that's a good segue to really maybe do a round two next time. And you mentioned at the beginning we can always go off at little tangents, and you it seems like this is a rabbit hole
It is.
in and of itself, and there's a lot of philosophical, ethical, technical questions to answer here. And this is precisely why I wanted to speak with you. And I know that we're sort of hitting the hour here, but if for people to contact you or get in touch with you, how should they go about it?
Oh, absolutely. People can get in touch with me. I have a Twitter account in which I tend to post some of my work-related stuff. My Twitter handle is Deydeb, Deydeb, and I'm also available on LinkedIn. And I believe, Barry, you and I are already connected on LinkedIn. Yeah, so definitely, I am very excited about this topic, and I'm passionate to engage in this discussion. So if anyone wants to reach out and share their thoughts, please, absolutely, well, you're welcome to.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of people, especially as because this is such a hot topic right now. This area of interfacing between us and the car is becoming more and more important. And I know that it's very nascent, as you mentioned before, but eventually these questions will have to be answered, especially if we want to arrive at a society where we can definitively say that we are in the next evolution of driving of self-driving cars. So, and I think your research and the work you're doing is paramount to making sure that that happens for not just in Europe, but I think across the world. And I think it sounds like there's a lot of things that need to be done, a lot of research and collaboration. But I have no doubt that you and your colleagues will have a lot to share in the next year or so.
I hope so. I hope not to disappoint.
Thanks very much for the quick. Thanks very much for the chat. I really hope everything goes well. And as I said before, we'll definitely do a round two sometime in the near future and see what you're up to. So thank you very much, Dave, and I really appreciate you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Barry. My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
All right.